In every relationship, there are moments when something just feels off. A look that lingers too long, a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, a sudden shift in routine that can't be explained. These moments, often dismissed as overthinking, are where the truth begins to surface. Beneath the surface of affection, laughter, and routine, emotional patterns start to change. Quietly but unmistakably. This is not about suspicion. This is about understanding the emotional habits that speak louder than words. Because long before the truth is revealed, the mind begins to confess. In this journey, we'll uncover three powerful emotional behaviors, clear, consistent, and deeply revealing, that often expose when a woman is emotionally invested somewhere else. Not through blame, but through awareness. Not through guesswork, but through psychological insight. The signs are there. You just have to know how to read them. It often begins in the quietest of ways. Not with shouting matches or dramatic exits, but with silence, a different kind of silence, subtle, stretched, and unfamiliar, the kind that fills a room even when you're sitting right next to each other. It's not that anything is explicitly wrong. In fact, everything might seem fine on the surface, but for anyone paying close attention, something is undeniably missing. In the rhythm of long-term relationships, emotional intimacy becomes the invisible thread that binds two people together. It's not just about the physical closeness or daily routines, it's about the feeling of being known, understood, and emotionally safe with someone. So when that thread begins to fray, even slightly, the entire connection can begin to unravel. This is where the unspoken distance creeps in. It's not loud, it's not obvious, but it's real. One of the clearest signs of emotional withdrawal is the fading of small, familiar gestures, the subtle touch on the shoulder that once felt second nature. The way she used to meet your eyes when you spoke, the spontaneous check-ins during the day, the inside jokes, the warmth in her tone, all start to wane. These are not just behavioral changes. These are emotional habits shifting in real time. What makes this phase so complex is that it rarely feels like betrayal at first. Instead, it often presents as stress, distraction, or personal preoccupation. She might say she's tired, that she has a lot on her plate. And that could very well be true, but emotional cheating, or the beginning of it, usually doesn't announce itself with a confession. It reveals itself in the erosion of presence. She's there, but not really there. For many men, this moment becomes a turning point. Something deep inside begins to register the change, even if the mind struggles to accept it. You start to notice she doesn't ask about your day the way she used to. Conversations become functional rather than meaningful. Intimacy becomes infrequent, sometimes forced, and slowly, the emotional bond that once felt effortless begins to feel like work. This is where confusion sets in, because nothing overt has happened. There's no evidence, no confrontation, just a growing sense that the connection you once relied on is slipping through your fingers, and in that gap, doubt begins to breed. But this distance is more than just a signal of dissatisfaction. It can be a precursor to emotional infidelity. When a woman begins to emotionally detach from her partner, it's rarely without cause. Whether consciously or unconsciously, she may be redirecting that emotional energy elsewhere. That elsewhere might not even be physical yet. It might be a colleague who listens a little more attentively, an old friend she reconnected with online, even just a fantasy of another life, free from current frustrations or disappointments, and that's what makes emotional cheating so powerful. It doesn't rely on opportunity alone. It grows in the spaces where connection once lived. It thrives in unmet needs, in the feeling of being misunderstood, unseen, or underappreciated. When the familiar becomes dull and the new feels thrilling, emotional boundaries start to shift. And once they do, returning to the original emotional rhythm becomes much harder. From a psychological perspective, the fading of emotional habits is not random. Humans are pattern-driven creatures. We maintain routines because they bring us comfort and consistency. When those routines break, especially the emotional ones, it's because something internal has shifted. She didn't just forget to say goodnight. She didn't just get busy and skip asking how your meeting went. These aren't accidents, they're micro indicators of disengagement. Over time, this disengagement becomes a new norm. The emotional check-ins are replaced by silence. The shared laughs turn into polite smiles. And when conflict arises, there's less fight. Not because the problems are gone, but because the investment is. Apathy begins to take the place of anger. And while anger still signals a connection, apathy means the cord has already started to sever. But here's where it gets even more complex. Some women experiencing this emotional shift will attempt to overcorrect. They may suddenly become more affectionate, more agreeable, even more sexually active. This is the guilt reflex in action, a subconscious attempt to maintain the status quo while managing the internal conflict of emotional duality. But this new affection doesn't feel grounded. It feels performative, like she's playing the role of a loving partner rather than actually being one. Still, the emotional distance remains. No amount of surface-level gestures can replace the organic bond of real emotional closeness, and the body knows it. The energy between two people doesn't lie. You feel it in the way she hugs you loose, distant, short. You hear it in her voice, careful, controlled, rehearsed. The natural ease is gone, and perhaps the hardest part of this experience is the gaslighting. Not just from her, but from yourself. You start to second, guess your own perceptions. Maybe you're overthinking it, maybe she's just stressed, maybe you're the one creating distance by being too suspicious, but deep down there's a part of you that knows. It's not paranoia, it's intuition. It's the mind picking up on what the heart is struggling to accept. In this stage, many men feel isolated, not just from their partner, but from their own clarity, because how do you confront something that hasn't been said out loud? How do you hold someone accountable for a feeling, a vibe, a subtle shift in emotional weight? And yet, this is the essence of emotional intelligence, being able to detect what isn't being spoken, seeing the truth in what's being left unsaid. The unspoken distance is not just the absence of words or actions. It's the space where intimacy used to live, and if left unaddressed, it grows, quietly, powerfully, until it becomes the new reality. One where two people share a life, but not a connection, where they speak but don't communicate, where they touch but don't feel. In the end, the fading of familiar emotions is rarely just a phase. It's a signpost, a signal, a turning point, one that, if noticed early, can invite healing and reconnection, or reveal truths that have been hiding just beneath the surface. Sometimes the biggest giveaways aren't in what someone hides, but in what they suddenly begin to give too much of. Overcompensation. It's one of the strangest, most deceptive emotional habits, because on the surface it looks like care, it looks like effort, but beneath it, something else is at play, something unsettled. Guilt, bubbling quietly beneath the surface, starts to show itself not through avoidance, but through an almost unnatural surge of attention. This is the guilt reflex in motion, a psychological response triggered when someone does something that conflicts with their own values yet isn't ready to face the full emotional consequence. For many women who find themselves emotionally or physically involved outside of their committed relationship, guilt doesn't always appear in obvious ways. In fact, it often takes the shape of more affection, not less. More compliments, more thoughtfulness. Suddenly, she's buying gifts, planning date nights, or texting sweet nothings more than usual. To the untrained eye, it can seem like things are finally improving. But for those who have lived through it, or studied it closely, the pattern is all too familiar. The reason guilt leads to overcompensation is because the mind craves balance. It's called cognitive dissonance, the internal discomfort that arises when actions contradict beliefs. So, when a woman begins to emotionally or physically stray from her partner, yet still sees herself as a loyal or morally sound person, that contradiction demands resolution. And because confession or confrontation would shatter the image she holds of herself or the relationship, she chooses a different path. She leans into good partner behavior, not because she feels closer, but because she feels further away and doesn't want that distance to show. But overcompensation isn't sustainable. It often appears in waves, sudden moments of heightened attention, followed by emotional withdrawal or irritability. That's the next layer of the guilt reflex, sudden sensitivity. Guilt doesn't just manifest as kindness. It can also turn to defensiveness. Questions that were once welcomed are now met with suspicion. Simple conversations become loaded. A harmless "where were you?" turns into "why don't you trust me?" The emotional temperature rises quickly, almost inexplicably. This sensitivity is rooted in fear, the fear of being found out, of being seen too clearly. When someone is carrying a secret, even the smallest inquiry can feel like an interrogation. That's why you might notice her becoming overly reactive, taking offense at things she would have brushed off before. She might accuse you of being controlling, even if your behavior hasn't changed. She might say you're distant, as a way to deflect attention from her own withdrawal. These are protective moves, not always conscious, but deeply revealing. And what makes it even more confusing is the cycle it creates. After the defensiveness comes another wave of guilt, which then leads to another burst of affection. The push and pull becomes emotionally exhausting, not just for her, but for you. One day she's incredibly attentive, the next she's irritable and cold. It's not inconsistency without reason, it's inconsistency rooted in unresolved conflict. People often think of guilt as a moral compass, something that keeps us from doing harm. But in reality, guilt can also fuel deception. It can motivate someone to hide the truth more carefully, not because they don't feel bad, but because they feel too bad to face what they've done. And so, rather than own it, they try to outlove it, outcare it. They attempt to rewrite the emotional narrative with gestures, because gestures are easier than confessions. In the broader scope of life and relationships, this is where many people get trapped. They begin to mistake overcompensation for genuine intimacy. The partner being cheated on might start to believe that things are finally getting better, that maybe the rough patch is over, maybe she's fallen back in love. But what's really happening is a temporary smokescreen, a performance to keep the truth from rising too quickly. It's important to understand this not as manipulation in the classic sense. Most people who exhibit these patterns aren't scheming or malicious. They're conflicted, torn between desire and duty, fear and honesty, and in that space, guilt becomes the tool they use to maintain control of themselves, of the relationship, of the narrative they want to believe. You'll also see guilt seep into the way she frames conversations. Suddenly, she's talking about how lucky she is to have you, how grateful she is. She might express concern over your stress, become more emotionally available, even suggest counseling or quality time. But again, it's not always rooted in authentic reconnection. It's an effort to realign herself with the version of the relationship she wishes were still real. The version where she was still fully present, still all in, still emotionally faithful. These shifts in behavior can be subtle or dramatic. For some, it's a slow escalation, small extra acts of kindness, unusually thoughtful texts, compliments out of the blue. For others, it's more extreme, elaborate romantic gestures, a sudden interest in rekindling passion, or even apologizing for past mistakes with heightened emotion. But all of these can be symptomatic of the guilt reflex. They're not always tied to love. They're often tied to fear, a fear of losing control, of being caught, of watching everything fall apart before she's ready. One of the more overlooked aspects of this pattern is how it impacts the partner on the receiving end. When you're suddenly getting more attention, you might feel hopeful, even relieved. You want to believe that things are improving, that your patience has paid off, but that hope, when not grounded in truth, becomes dangerous. Because when the pattern breaks again, and it usually does, you're left even more confused than before. You start to question your own instincts. You wonder if you imagined the good moments, or if you're now being unfair for noticing the shifts again. This psychological whiplash can be emotionally devastating, and yet it's incredibly common in relationships where emotional or physical infidelity is present but unspoken. The cycle of guilt, overcompensation, sensitivity, and retreat becomes the new normal. It replaces genuine emotional intimacy with a kind of emotional performance, and in time, it becomes harder and harder to tell what's real and what's not. Understanding the guilt reflex isn't about catching someone in the act. It's about recognizing patterns that don't align with emotional truth. It's about seeing beyond the gestures and asking why they're happening now, why the sudden urgency to prove affection, why the emotional fragility when trust is questioned, why the inconsistency between words and energy. Life teaches us that not all distance is physical and not all closeness is honest. Sometimes the most intense expressions of love appear right when something underneath is breaking. And sometimes guilt dresses itself up as devotion, not to heal the relationship, but to silence the storm within. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, one small change at a time. A shifted phone screen, a shorter reply, a browser history that's suddenly empty. At first, you tell yourself not to worry. Everyone deserves a little privacy. Everyone wants space sometimes, but then it keeps happening. And the transparency that once felt natural between you both begins to cloud over, not with confrontation, but with quiet, calculated adjustments. This is the privacy shift. The moment transparency turns opaque. In the early stages of most committed relationships, there's a rhythm of openness, not because anyone is forced to share, but because they want to. There's a sense of safety in mutual vulnerability. You talk about your day, your thoughts, your texts, your friends, because nothing needs to be hidden. But when emotional loyalty starts to fracture, that openness often becomes the first casualty. It's rarely obvious. There's no signpost announcing it. But if you've been paying attention, you'll feel it. And more importantly, you'll feel the effort it now takes to see her clearly. A woman who was once freely communicative might now keep things vague. Where she once offered details without being asked, she now leaves blanks you're expected not to notice. Where she once left her phone face up, she now places its screen down. She starts taking it with her everywhere, even to places where she used to leave it behind. The password that was once shared or casually mentioned is now quietly changed. Notifications are suddenly turned off. The quiet hum of transparency is now buried beneath layers of selective silence. This isn't just about technology or access, it's about emotional availability. Because privacy in itself isn't suspicious. Healthy relationships thrive when both people maintain personal boundaries and a sense of individuality. But the shift, the sudden, uncharacteristic protection of those boundaries, is what signals something deeper. When someone starts guarding what was once openly shared, it often means there's something behind the curtain they don't want you to see. What makes this shift particularly disorienting is how subtle it is. It's not like she outright says she's hiding something. In fact, she might still be warm, still physically present, still going through the motions. But the energy changes, the emotional ease between you fades, replaced by a slight tension, a hesitation, a wall you didn't even know was being built until you run into it. You might catch her pausing before answering a simple question, her words more calculated than casual. She may start keeping separate accounts of her day, withholding pieces not because they're incriminating in themselves, but because they're part of a larger story she's not ready to share. Conversations become shorter. Her eyes don't hold yours quite as long. When you bring up the shift, she might laugh it off, accuse you of being paranoid, or say you're imagining things, and so you start to doubt your instinct, even though deep down something doesn't feel right. This is how emotional disconnection often begins, not with a fight, but with fragmentation, and it's a fragmentation that hides in routine. On the surface, life might look unchanged. She's still making dinner, still sitting next to you on the couch, still replying when you speak, but emotionally she's drifting, not dramatically, just enough to stop sharing the full picture. The shift in privacy is often a self-protection mechanism. If she's entertaining feelings for someone else, or already involved in something outside the relationship, she may start compartmentalizing her life. The version of herself you interact with becomes edited. Curated, you get the pieces she's comfortable showing. The rest is tucked away behind halves, miles, and vague excuses. It's no longer about being close. It's about managing perception. One of the hardest things about recognizing this shift is that it doesn't come with proof. There's no confession, no confrontation, just a growing list of small moments that feel off. A missed call she doesn't mention, a name that pops up and is quickly dismissed, a weekend plan that stays oddly vague. These aren't smoking guns, but they're smoke, and where there's smoke, there's usually a fire burning somewhere out of sight. In real life, people don't always cheat with malice. Sometimes it starts with emotional confusion. A conversation that feels too good. A connection that feels easy in a way your current relationship doesn't anymore. And before they know it, they've stepped across a line. When that happens, guilt and self-preservation kick in. That's when the privacy shift begins, not necessarily to deceive you, but to delay the fallout, to preserve the comfort of the current life while flirting with the temptation of another. But emotional opacity doesn't just affect the one who's being distant. It deeply impacts the one who's left in the dark. You might start questioning yourself, wondering if you're too controlling, too sensitive, too suspicious. You might try harder, give more, attempt to restore the transparency by being even more open yourself. But when that openness isn't reciprocated, the emotional imbalance grows. Trust, once eroded, is hard to rebuild without truth. Sometimes the privacy shift has nothing to do with cheating at all. It could be emotional burnout, personal stress, or even depression. But even in those cases, the lack of transparency still signals a rupture in connection. The point isn't to jump to conclusions, it's to be aware of the patterns. Because when someone is emotionally invested in a relationship, even during hard times, they don't hide their inner world. They might retreat, but they don't shut the door completely. In relationships, trust isn't just built on honesty. It's built on consistency. When a woman's emotional behavior changes in tandem with her physical habits, when she becomes more private, more guarded, more selective with her presence, those changes rarely come from nowhere. There's almost always an underlying shift that needs to be explored. You'll know it when the conversations that used to feel easy now feel monitored, when her phone becomes a barrier instead of a bridge. When her schedule feels more like a puzzle you're not meant to solve. These aren't just quirks. They're signs, not of betrayal necessarily, but of disconnection. And disconnection, when ignored, becomes distance. That distance can stretch across days, weeks, even months, until one day you wake up and realize you're sharing space with someone whose emotional world is no longer open to you. Understanding the privacy shift isn't about surveillance or suspicion. It's about emotional intelligence. It's about recognizing that when someone stops letting you in, they're often already investing themselves elsewhere, even if that elsewhere is just in a future without you. And in the slow fade from transparency to secrecy, what's most often lost is not just access, but intimacy. Most of what people say isn't said with words. The truth of who we are, what we want, what we fear, what we're hiding, often leaks through in tiny, involuntary expressions. A flicker of the eyes, a twitch of the lips, a shift in tone that lasts less than a second. These micro-expressions are like cracks in the mask, giving us a glimpse into the raw, unfiltered truth underneath. And in relationships, especially when emotional loyalty begins to waver, those cracks become more telling than anything said out loud. Reading someone's micro-expressions isn't about becoming a human lie detector. It's about tuning in to what your gut already suspects, because long before someone confesses, and long before anything becomes undeniably obvious, the body speaks. It betrays hesitation, discomfort, excitement, and guilt. These signs are subtle, but they're consistent, and once you know what to look for, it becomes impossible to ignore them. When a woman is emotionally connected, her body language tends to mirror yours. There's openness in her posture, softness in her eyes, the rhythm of your interactions flows naturally. She listens, engages, and responds without tension. But when that emotional connection starts to shift, especially if she's mentally or emotionally investing in someone else, her physical cues change, not dramatically but perceptibly. A delay in her smile, a glance away during moments that once felt intimate, a sudden rigidity where there used to be ease. These aren't conscious choices. That's what makes them so revealing. People can control their words. They can even control their actions to a certain extent, but the body, the micro, muscles in the face, the way eyes react, how the voice falters, those are harder to fake. For example, the eyes are often a giveaway, not just where they look, but how they respond emotionally. A partner who used to light up at your presence now offers a glance that's vacant, delayed, or slightly forced, when a laugh feels rehearsed. When a compliment is followed by a micro-tightening of the lips, these things don't scream betrayal, but they whisper disconnection. It's not about jumping to conclusions every time someone blinks the wrong way. It's about noticing patterns when she talks about her day and her smile doesn't quite reach her eyes, when you ask how she's feeling and she answers quickly, too quickly, with a practiced calm that doesn't match the moment. These are not accidents, they're adaptations, signs of someone managing an internal story they don't want to share. What's powerful about micro-expressions is that they usually surface in emotionally charged moments. When there's tension, confrontation, or an unexpected question, the body often reacts before the brain can apply the filter. So in the split second after you ask, "Is everything okay between us?" before the words come out, her facial muscles might flinch, her eyes might dart, her breath might quicken. These reactions are brief, but they're real. And they often reveal far more than any verbal reassurance ever could. This becomes even more important in situations where communication has started to feel strained. When someone doesn't want to tell the full truth, their mind goes into defense mode. The result is often a mix of over-clarifying and emotional distancing. She might say everything is fine, but the energy behind her words is off. You feel it in the way her tone rises just a little too high, or her sentence ends with a nervous laugh. Maybe she's looking down more than usual when she talks. Maybe she's pausing too long before answering simple questions. These things don't necessarily mean something terrible is happening. but they do mean something is shifting inside. In life, we're trained to focus on the big stuff, the arguments, the decisions, the dramatic confessions. But in reality, it's the small moments that hold the deepest truths. The human brain is wired for authenticity. When we lie or hide things, even from ourselves, our bodies experience stress. That stress doesn't always manifest in obvious ways. Sometimes it's a clenched jaw during a calm conversation. Sometimes it's an unnatural stillness when talking about future plans. The body pulls back when the heart no longer feels safe being seen. This is why so many people who have experienced infidelity say they knew long before they knew. Their partner didn't necessarily admit it. There wasn't always concrete proof, but the signs were their tiny, consistent cues that something was off, a missing warmth, a new tension, emotional gaps that used to be filled with ease and familiarity. These gaps aren't just emotional, they're physical, behavioral, psychological, and most of them show up in the smallest, quietest moments. Understanding this isn't about becoming suspicious of every move. It's about deepening your emotional awareness, recognizing that communication is more than words, that when someone's emotional loyalty is elsewhere, their expressions begin to misalign with their spoken narrative. They say they're happy, but their eyes scan the room. They say they love you, but their body leans away when you reach for them. They say they're just tired, but their smile fades the moment you stop looking. One of the most difficult things in any relationship is knowing when to trust your instincts, especially when the other person is telling you everything is fine. But instinct doesn't lie. It's not just a feeling. It's a reaction to subtle information your brain is processing before your conscious mind can catch up. And often, that information comes from micro-expressions, those fleeting indicators that something isn't being said. It's important to recognize that this isn't about catching someone or assigning blame. Sometimes those micro-expressions point to deeper emotional struggles that have nothing to do with infidelity. They can indicate inner conflict, fear of confrontation, emotional exhaustion, or even suppressed needs that haven't been voiced. But they do mean something. They're signals that a deeper conversation is needed, not about what's been done, but about what's being felt. In relationships, honesty isn't just about telling the truth. It's about being aligned emotionally, physically, and mentally. When someone's inner world starts to drift away, the first signs aren't always in what they say. They're in what they can't help but show, and for those who are paying attention, the face often tells the story the mouth is afraid to share. Life rarely offers the perfect moment where all truths are revealed cleanly and clearly. Instead, it gives us thousands of little moments, glances, pauses, reactions, that quietly piece together a much bigger picture, a picture that, once fully formed, becomes impossible to unsee. There's a certain look people get when they're physically present but mentally gone. You've seen it before, maybe across the dinner table, maybe in the middle of a conversation that once would have sparked laughter, now met with silence or a faint nod. Her eyes are on you, but they're looking through you. She smiles, but there's a heaviness behind it. Something has shifted. She's still there in the routine, still saying the right words, still playing the part. But her spirit, her investment, her emotional energy has gone elsewhere. This is what it looks like when someone has emotionally checked out. In life, escape doesn't always mean leaving. People don't always pack a bag, walk out the door, or slam it behind them. Sometimes escape happens in the mind first. Quietly, slowly, thought by thought, feeling by feeling, the heart drifts before the body ever moves. And in relationships, this emotional escape is one of the hardest things to spot, because everything might still look intact from the outside. But on the inside, she's already left the room. Emotional escape doesn't always begin with betrayal. Sometimes it starts with neglect. Not necessarily intentional neglect, but the kind that builds in busy lives, when communication thins out, when affection becomes transactional, when you're living parallel lives instead of intertwined ones. Over time, she might stop voicing her needs, not because she doesn't have them, but because she's convinced they won't be heard. That's where withdrawal begins, not as punishment, but as protection. When a woman begins to emotionally check out, she's often protecting herself from a relationship that no longer feels emotionally safe. It doesn't mean there was abuse. It doesn't mean you were cruel. Sometimes it just means she's been feeling unseen, unheard, or unappreciated for so long that she gave up trying. And when someone gives up trying, the connection doesn't explode, it fades, and that fading is almost always invisible at first. She might still be doing the daily routines, cooking, texting, showing up to family events, but the spirit behind it, the emotional warmth, is no longer attached. It's like watching someone perform a role they no longer believe in. A performance without conviction. You'll notice it in the pauses, the silences that stretch just a little too long, the fact that she no longer lights up when she sees you, the way she disengages from moments that once brought her joy. This emotional escape can happen for a variety of reasons. For some, it's about unmet emotional needs. For others, it's about mental exhaustion or a sense of hopelessness about the relationship ever changing. And in many cases, it's not even about the partner, it's about an internal reckoning. She may be wrestling with her own identity, questioning who she is and what she really wants. When that self-exploration collides with relationship dissatisfaction, emotional distance becomes a natural, if unspoken, response. Here's what's crucial to understand. Emotional escape is often not about another person. At least not at first. It's about herself, her unspoken needs, her longing for connection, her fantasies of freedom or renewal or rediscovery, but in some cases, someone else, someone new, someone exciting, becomes the outlet for those desires. Not necessarily because she planned it, but because her emotional world had already made space for something, or someone else to enter. That's why the signs are so easy to miss. When someone's emotionally escaping, they don't always act angry. They don't always argue. In fact, many people who are emotionally gone are incredibly calm, detached, unbothered, and that's what makes it so unsettling. You can feel it when someone has stopped reacting, when your words no longer carry weight, when your presence no longer moves them. It's not coldness, it's emptiness. In real life, emotional escape often coexists with guilt. She may not fully understand what's happening inside her. She might still care deeply about you as a person, even if her romantic feelings have dulled. That tension between wanting to be honest and not wanting to hurt you can lead her to stay physically close while mentally miles away. So she shows up, but she's no longer showing up. And over time, that absence creates a deep sense of confusion in the relationship. You start to feel like you're the only one trying, like you're carrying a weight that used to be shared. You ask questions and get short answers. You express needs and get a nod or a polite smile. Nothing outright cruel, nothing dramatic, just a slow, steady erosion of connection. You might even feel guilty for noticing it, for bringing it up. But deep down, you know the intimacy is fading, and not because of one big mistake, but because the foundation has been crumbling for a long time. When someone emotionally checks out, they often begin to romanticize an alternative life. Not necessarily an affair, but a different version of themselves. Happier, freer, more fulfilled. That fantasy becomes an emotional refuge. A place where they imagine what it would feel like to start over, to reclaim parts of themselves that feel lost or buried in the current relationship. And the more they retreat into that world, the less present they are in this one. It's not that they don't feel affection. It's that the emotional bond, the glue that once held everything together, no longer sticks. You might be doing everything you've always done, but now it lands differently. It no longer resonates because she's tuned into a different emotional frequency. And when two people are operating on different emotional wavelengths, even the best intentions can get lost in translation. Sometimes the signs are so subtle they're easy to dismiss: a new focus on independence, a desire for more alone time, a shift in how much she shares about her day, a growing disinterest in resolving conflicts, a reluctance to make future plans. None of these are alarming on their own, but together they create a pattern of disengagement. What makes emotional escape so difficult to address is that it often doesn't feel urgent. There's no big fight, no crisis, just a quiet sense that something's off, and because there's no obvious catalyst, it's easy to delay the conversation, to hope that things will go back to normal. But emotional escape rarely reverses itself without a reckoning, without real, vulnerable dialogue, and often, by the time one partner is ready to talk, the other is already emotionally gone. In real relationships, people don't always leave because of what's happening between them. Sometimes they leave because of what's happening within them, and emotional escape is rarely about one moment. It's about accumulation, a buildup of small disappointments, unexpressed needs, unhealed hurts. Over time, those things become too heavy to carry, so they get dropped, not through confrontation, but through distance. And that distance can grow without a sound, without a goodbye, without a warning. Until one day, you look across the room and realize the person sitting across from you is a stranger, not because you don't know them, but because they no longer feel known. In the end, emotional distance isn't about vanishing bodies, it's about vanishing presence. It's about the quiet moments where love used to live, now filled with polite nods and hollow routines. When someone emotionally checks out, they don't always slam the door. Sometimes they leave while staying right in front of you. That's what makes it so devastating, because you can't fix what you can't see, and you can't reach someone who's no longer reaching back. But within that silence lies a truth many refuse to face. Connection requires presence, and presence requires honesty, not just with each other, but with ourselves. Emotional escape isn't always betrayal. Sometimes it's a slow cry for change, a signal that the relationship needs more than maintenance. It needs revival. And if that revival doesn't come, the quiet departure becomes inevitable. So if you feel it, that fading, that space, that shift, don't ignore it. Don't wait for the storm to break when the wind is already changing. Speak, ask, listen, because the longer you pretend not to notice, the harder it becomes to bring her back, or to walk away with your own heart still intact. Sometimes the bravest act of love is recognizing when it's already gone.